Welcome to YouTube Masterclass, everyone. This is the COURSERA's Harvard, USC, and CALARTS wings for its study. I think it's going to be a beautiful class today. I have important information to share with you about the Poetics of Aristotle. That this particular translation is by Stephen Halliwell. He also does the commentary about. I'll show you the book. It's a beautiful book, The Poetics, and I really require that we all get a copy if we don't have one, if we're interested in the philosophy of aesthetics at all, and that this is the beginning of the philosophy of aesthetics, is what we need to look at today as to how it operates in Aristotle's world of the Poetics, even so much so as in the Platonic world, Plato's world of the aesthetics, which is happening around the same time in 300 BC, and these great thinkers came along and wrote the first surviving articles about the nature of aesthetics and the philosophy of aesthetics. And philosophy is just taking the hardest question and making it harder because you're trying to trace back the history when it's ontology, or find the abstract nature in it now when it's a forward-looking philosophy like modernism. That Aristotle is a classicist isn't the reason they call these plays the classics, although it's similar to that, because that in his world, like the neoclassical Shakespeare, for instance, his worlds were classical, but that he's been extended as an existential modernist is still in his work. And so now we look at theater as a whole as being discussed by Aristotle, one of the first surviving discussions of the nature of aesthetics and how aesthetics run. And then all through this, Aristotle points out realism is what he favors. He calls it mimesis, and the reason it's called mimesis is because it's a picture of reality, and by a picture he doesn't have photographs, so he means like a painting of a realistic moment, or a moment that theater has taken in time, even if they are trading times in the sequence of the play. They're still showing and animating a moment in time. That film is more interesting because it is interesting in a way because it's the canvas is like the theater. I mean, that we see through this proscenium into the form we've talked about is practically the mirror image that you're getting on the screen, and how it's compiled on the screen and fits within the screen, and what goes beyond the screen is all taken into the mise-en-scène, which can be form, and mise-en-scène requires these long takes. So if you're taking that impression of reality, Bazin would say, then you're taking in the medium that needs to be created or recreated as realistic. Remember those films we talked about, those war films by Rossellini, and how realistic they were, but how they happened moments after the things that happened in reality happened, and then they had to recreate it because they were still associated with the national company that had like specific rules on how you can make real documentaries and realist films, and then narrative films that are like documentaries, and then there's narrative films that are fiction films, and that fiction tends to be the genre among books and among movies that's going to be the most popular of the genre. Well, that we're dealing with fiction here in Aristotle is very clear, because he's taking this whole notion of reality as though that is what literature of theater is the notion of reality and how to recreate it. That symbolism is what he would maintain as the gods. And one point that Aristotle makes clear on at the beginning of the Poetics is that when all the instruments are playing at once, they're making the best music, because there's more instruments playing. They have to be playing on key and with each other in a melody and harmony. But if they follow the rules of music, the more instruments they have, Aristotle says, the better off they'll be. It's like that myth of total cinema. Bazin is coming straight from this. It's like the more we add to it, the sound medium is better, Bazin is saying, because it's more realistic to have sound than in these silent films, which are unrealistic, right? But that some of them cater to the unrealism, and that some of them are playing on a reality that does include dialogue, except that it hasn't been invented as something to think about, but that Bazin is calling for a better tomorrow of cinema, that color is going to outdo black and white, he predicts, and that like widescreen will prevail, and it'll be a widescreen, and hi-fi stereo, And we do love that. I say I've seen Apocalypse Now Redux in IMAX, and I was really enjoying that. And I would not take that from the screen or form of cinema lightly, because that's pushing all boundaries beyond just the frame of the film and into the reality of everyday life. I mean, that if every day, like I said last year, every day I'll be quoting Apocalypse Now for the rest of my life anyway, I mean, like, of course, it's like you get up, you quote Apocalypse Now, you get your day going, That's just the way it's changed our lives. And the reality of the situation is, I think Aristotle would have liked the realism of the classical era, even in Hollywood, because as much as it's moderated between scenes, and Aristotle does say flowery dialogue can be a moderation between scenes, but that we're learning that the moderation of anything can and will take away from how realistic the moment's starting to be. Now, we've seen in certain movies, like Woody Allen's movies, that Greek choruses wear these big masks and they shout through them. Well, that may be true, but they're still going for a certain type of realism that Aristotle's talking about, not just literature, but like theatrical literature and how it deals with reality. And before I go on further about Aristotle, I just want to present a Platonic point of view. That his point was to only make art, especially theater, about soldiers and God, or gods. And that God isn't as worthy as the soldier to make the movie about, because the soldier stood up for God and that's why he's a soldier. Then, I mean, even Plato's kind of a humanist here, because he's saying that the soldier is the most valuable of all the gods, because he fought for the gods, and win or lose, soldiers always win, because that's what all art should be about. We have war movies in America, and we love war movies in America, and we're not ashamed to put up right there in the film who we went to war with and who we're still going to war with. And we're not ashamed to talk about that in America. And we make war movies, and some people would think, well, let's just be part of the war machine. And it's not like this trap of thinking that all Hegelians just become a part of the war machinery and just support it because it's the war we want. It's the complications and day-to-day battles of the soldier that we see in the lives of these real men who are doing real jobs for our country is amazing. So I can see Plato's point of view on only venerating soldiers. And really, if there was a law that we could only venerate soldiers in the movie, I'd be for it. It wouldn't sound so like border damage to me. It would be like, well, the most honored ones get honored, to all be the sure, And Aristotle doesn't really judgment against this, but he says there are basically like 7 types of theater, and all of them have music, and all of them have dialogue, and all of them have twists and turns through the plots, and all of them are based on mythologies. Sometimes they're mixed up mythologies, and Plato goes all through the mythologies of Oedipus being as part of the ancient theater, or ancient Greek theater, and Lysistrata, which we've talked about, the Lysistrata, and that's totally part of ancient theater. That Satyricon is somewhere in ancient theater, somewhere in ancient literature. There's even a movie version of some of these films, and like Fellini did a version of Satyricon, for instance. And it's just interesting that we're talking about the same Latin writing as Satyricon as Aristotle almost, and then we get this whole Satyricon outlook by Fellini that's really just this big spectacle of this arena, this sword and sandal epics of the silent era. And we're not discounting the silent era, just to let you know. We love the silent era and how it rests on Aristotle's poetics more than any other period, especially the melodrama. We're just saying that, like, the myth of total cinema isn't to derate another form of cinema. It's that it's coming, this bigger medium that everybody can work with, and everybody will call cinema, is growing into this thing. And then it might have evolved to the point of the IMAX, and that's where it's, and the sound you get there with the THX and everything. It may have evolved to the myth of total cinema, and like those wraparound films I said about. But that the avant-garde is not discounted from Aristotle is true, that he does say that anything that's within the theatrical limitation is by far means judged as a theatrical production in use in some way of the multi-spectacled theatrical arenas of ancient Greece. And I don't think he calls it ancient because it's his day and age. He wouldn't sit around going, this is going to sound ancient one day, but here we go. And I know there's a lot of you at the Aristotle Foundation, like my cousin Jason Sheley, for instance. Now he shapes it, that knows way more about Aristotle. That we've got books over here that are just crammed full of all of his writings is on the shelf. I have all the writings of Aristotle on the shelf that I got it on my, shelf is enough to know that there's enough more Aristotle to read and circumference. But one thing I like about the form of metaphysics and aesthetics is we can always say they're symbolic, and we can always say they're somehow it's an item representing an item. It's like an imagination. It's like we say one thing is another. And in theater, you believe that. Because if you were to set up object A as different than object B, but then say in the movie that they're the same thing, you can do that with cinema. It's not really something that's forbidden of the cinema, but when you rack it out to get the most theatrical angle, then you're in the realism mode, and then you're doing more along the lines of creating a mimesis. Now, why create a mimesis? Now, this is the interesting thing. You never ask why, but is there something wrong with my respective reality that isn't just a respective reality at all? Isn't that already saying A is B and they're the same? You have to take my judgment for what I say. No, that's not what a director does. The director seeks out usually what the audience wants and wants what they want in terms of getting entertainment. Especially that's why the fiction world works so well, because the nonfiction is already solved and the fiction world can leave unresolved, as though documentaries can leave unresolved in the modern form, even in a hyper-realism of like John Cassavetes' A Woman Under the Influence type documentary of a narrative film that's like this improv, So that Aristotle's talking about the taxation of instruments, he is also talking about anonymity, not for the gods, but perhaps the stars who are going to come out of this, he doesn't want either, because now Aristotle is saying we go to see the players perform the play, and now we judge them by the realism they bring. But there's one other thing we've got to talk about, and that's catharsis. Now, we could talk about peripatesis, because that's walking a long way. We could talk about hypokinesis, which is a vast amount of energy you can have stored up in your system that can be like subatomic particles that can react to how fast or slow you go. And they're like midi-chlorians. Yeah, Aristotle talks about that in some of his books. But the vast energy placed on the realism makes it, and everyone knows that reality has a conflict in it. Its conflict not only is what brings from the theater to become reality for us watching in the theatrical terms what our own reality is, and there's a conflict between what we all see and accept is the level of how they've portrayed that specific reality, be it a fantasy world. The reality of the fantasy world still pays back to our margin of effort in this world we have now. And the formalism being part and parcel to the reality in classical Hollywood is how we can see that Aristotle is going to say, yes, we want these massive displays of just reality in its splendor. And by reality, I'm not talking about the realism of modernism that shows us down to our squalor state, which the squalor state can be like a mythology, right? I'm talking about when we're glorified to the gods but there's always something challenging us before we can get the glorification of the gods. The gods have asked us to do something, and there goes the play. Because now there's a conflict until the end, which the end can come just to resolve the conflict, as it does in so many of the Oedipus stories. It comes to an end before the tragedy gets worse. Before anything gets worse, we're coming to an end, right? So what I find fascinating about a book like The Poetics is that it's written more of the theater, but it does still challenge us to see what we accept as reality, and classical reality especially. poetic reality. Why does that form not surprise me if he's talking about the poetics? And why does he use the word poetics? Because that was the word used for theater in the Greek times. But what's profound about this book is you can begin to see that the real conflict is a narrative conflict, or even a non-narrative conflict would be for the film to end would be a conflict. See? No, not a conflict resolutor, but that's a little more dicey to explain because the avant-garde is seeking to see everything at once in one of its respects of theater. That there's infinite respects to the avant-garde is what makes me say that. But that it can be calculated to have every single image from every image ever taken in one image, that the computer can just boot that up right away is like probably true in about 100 years. When we just boot up 100 images at once, and if even 2 of them are about me, that's cool. No, I'm kidding. But there's a kind of interest in these conflicts of interest, because what really motivates the viewer to be conflicted with the play a lot of times is the same conflict as the play presents, in such a way that they're saying if it's tragedy, the conflict is probably going to win, and that's your resolution, but that creates catharsis too, and that's the next point of Aristotle, is catharsis. And if you're going to have mimesis, or reality created so delicately from the bonds of its own creation only to vie for that it's reality, then the conflict isn't just, well, is this our version of reality? Is this our version of reality? Or was it the bonds of its own creation to say, we're provoking a reality that this form may say is as we perceive the real in history? That's another point of view. The catharsis isn't only looking at that conflict, but at the narrative conflict that usually sets that off in being something's impossible that we need to get done. And in mythology, this is better than mythological threshold guardians, which are the things that keep us from getting too close to the inmost cave, where the final threshold guardian is keeping our elixir and requires some kind of battle, like a witch's duel or something, in Harry Potter. It would be like, we've got to get that elixir, and then we've got to take it back home, back the same path we already fought through, and destroyed everything in our path, like the Lord of the Rings or something. There's mowing down mountaintop after mountaintop of all of its altered beasts. No, I'm kidding. So I'm looking at this Aristotle, and I didn't open to it randomly. There's no way to do that, considering it's all broken down on which chapter is which, but while the book is still going, this is saying that the style of the play is the language and the rhythm, which is the media. Now, it can also be the language, rhythm, and melody, which is the media. Now, I'm going to say that's lyric poetry, language, rhythm, melody. But that just means there's more than one style of linguistic interaction between the characters, communication on the characters, spoken word between them, that if they're giving a narrative on a poem, on an epic poem, that they would have their melody in check, that if it's just style, we're only looking at the language and the rhythm, and the language and the rhythm of that language does equal the media, but the style is the language and the rhythm. Now, if I'm to interpret this to today's length, again, it's a multiple code of why there is speaking and how we get to the conflict, which creates the conflict in languages. These oracles will disagree with man in Oedipus or other tales where there's oracles. They disagree with the further male choice of the hero is going to get ransacked as soon as he realizes he should have listened to the oracle. Even if he tried to avoid it, he'd run right into it, And that's really what they're saying here, is that, like, that kind of language where it's like discursive, but it's also enwrapped in tragedy, is being completely honed out into this dramaturgy by Aristotle, who's saying we need to flex away from tragedy and head to the area of drama, because it's not like in all these plays the gods die. Right now we're getting into this more modern form of Aristotle's version of classical, right? Because he's saying that the human nature of the play is what actually is the conflict of the narrative, and the human nature creates its own spectacle of problematics, even in how it's represented in the theater, is going to pay off in all the Aristotelian modes of language and rhythm, which is the style of the play, because the style, we know, a lot of times is dictated by the auteur or the director of the play, or the actors of the play in these senses, which are more of the authors of the play. But that the authors are these really gifted, well-paid playwrights of Aristotle's day is one thing that I love about how he can get into that mode. And so I'm not going to bore you all with more Aristotle readings. We're still going to go on with class. Class has about 40 more minutes, and there's a lot more to go. And I would say look into it yourself, because on the one hand, while it exonerates the poetics and everything to do with theater, melodrama, especially in how melodrama is this genre that takes all these larger-than-life elements out of our life and symbolizes it and metaphoricalizes the history of the reality of the way we see our own genealogies played out in these ancient theaters all the way up to the screen today. And the screen today, again, has learned from these modulars like the Poetics of Aristotle that the realism of films can somehow come not just from studying the poetics, but learning how to adjust a camera so it can pick up the type of lighting that Aristotle's even getting at when it comes to lighting a play, not just that's taking place at night, but how to light up a play and how to put lights on them. All the things that are masking arrangements for the play are discussed in Aristotle, which is why I love the Poetics, because it shows how to put on a play, like how to set decorate, how to build a set, how to get actors to be realistic, how to get actors to be formalized in a realist way, how to get how big to build a theater, what instruments to use in the orchestra, I mean, all these things are discussed in the Poetics, like he's building King Solomon's temple. And they're all the way we describe them now, and the theaters are all built like that now. But that it would lead to cinema is only because cinema is just an automated theater. It's where all the players are moving on their own, right when you press play or go into the theater, and the projectionist puts it in right away and you see it. That it's encapsulating different cuts doesn't change the fact that the shot itself depths into a theater, particularly realism. It's hard to think of a realism other than the one we're going to talk about next that is actually montage-like in its realism. And I'm not talking about propaganda films, because propaganda films I'm not really going over right now because of some disinterest in the material. But not just that, it's like the material's great in some ways, but to see a propaganda from a point of view that disparages propaganda is problematic only in the sense that I won't give it due justice for what it's supposedly encoding in our minds as a great thing. Because I don't necessarily watch a film to be encoded in my mind, but if that's what it's doing, I probably wouldn't be able to contextualize that that's what's happening. I couldn't be here like, well, suddenly I'm getting a code. Excuse me, everyone. To only like this. I'm getting too excited, so I'm coughing, right? I don't mean to do that, class. Smoker cough, right? So these things are realistic to the avant-garde. And they're realistic in a different kind of way, because in Cubism, we have a realism up to what the perception is in the theory of relativity of aesthetics. That we all see something different when we see something as true. And that these artists, from Duchamp, Ray Panleave, the scientist that showed how seahorses were born, Epstein, Vorkapich, Florey, Strand, Eisenstein. Well, I spoke too soon, because here we have Eisenstein in a very special context. It's called sentimental romance. And that he's able to travel this piano player into the air through scenery that's all dissolved together and that she's floating out into the heavens while she's playing sentimental romance on piano is only to venerate her as an artist. And I don't think that he was taking money from her for some cause, right? He was trying to win money for her in this kind of preemptory music video world of Eisenstein. So I'm not going to criticize him for making a great avant-garde film like Sentimental Romance, which is located on this hard to track down, very rare Kino collection of avant-garde. And why do I bring up the avant-garde now? It's because it's a vast difference from even Platonic arts or Aristotle's aesthetics to down to, we're saying, the modern to almost post-structural, postmodern range. And we all know that the structuralists, many of them came from this movement, and that is where you take language to its core and define every word as you're going along. And if you define every word as you're going along while you're reading, then you can show what the book is really trying to say in its subtext or between the lines that you can read a book underneath it, is because the subtext is there to be defined by the choice of words, and what order they go in is also something that more post-structuralism takes a chance in saying that's political. Any language that goes in any language for any motivation is political at all, even in its unmotivation. That's just apolitical, and that's a form of political, right? So here we have post-structuralism all of a sudden, and structuralism is more of the definitions of each word in the sentence, more that we can judge it from side to side is interesting, that it's an equalizer of words we find useful so that no one word becomes more punchy than another one isn't the point. It's so that we can dictate what the real meaning of this language is without being political, or what it, if it would serve a purpose, demoted of its political side to even form language that would make sense. And I see how you're going to say, well, I thought post-structuralism defined the political, but the structuralism is more looking to equalize it in terms of these are all defined words if they're even being used. And I think that that's a more formal consideration of even in cinema montage, and how we get to Eisenstein again as he's building these propaganda montages, but that he's actually building a story through them is how we can actually tolerate that. I think that Hans Richter deserves a heads up on this avant-garde disc, because he's the one that did Ghost Before Breakfast, and that's the one where all the hats are jumping around and they're having a good time. Now, one thing I noticed about Hans Richter, he said that he had a film that, and it was like Ghosts Before Breakfast, that's on this double disc, and that he, after he made it, right away when Hitler took power, not everybody from Germany's film industry had fled to America, like many were hoping to, like Fritz Lang made it over to America and sort of took over as a film noir captain of the studios, whereas just as high of an honor as being in charge of UFA and making Metropolis and these other movies we still cover. But the Metropolis is Lang really being avant-garde, but in a sci-fi way, to invent almost the genre of sci-fi, that we know the robot in Metropolis is what C-3PO looks like. We know that there's a devilish plot afoot because there's a devil sign used above the robot's head in one of the scenes that's unforgettable. That is a scary movie, Metropolis. It's got a lot of things to be scared about, that the rich kind of evade ever helping the poor all throughout the whole thing, and it's still like supposedly resolved. It's kind of a hyper intense way of looking at acceptance of everyday life if it seems to be unfair to you in that way, but that they're less about being unfair than that they are about having certain freedoms is definitely more of a dim look. And it's like my Potemkin article goes on Metropolis. It's like, if this is your ideal reality, then I'm sorry that it's not quite working out for you, because it seems like everybody's utopias keep breaking down. And that's a total trick of cinema that even Aristotle's going to use, is that once you set up the utopia, which is the real visuals, then it breaks down and falls apart into this whole, why didn't we keep it the right way? Why didn't we structure it the right way? Why weren't we going to build these visuals the right way? And so the Ghost Before Breakfast disappears after the Third Reich starts banning film. And then the copy that's found, like at the French New Wave or whatever, Henry Langlois or whoever found Ghost Before Breakfast and other Hans Richter films, found these films after they barely survived being all their copies burned, other copies were kept of them was only because some of the German industry did not want to be destroyed, and that we lost a lot of good movies from that era. Interesting, the original Berlin Alexanderplatz still exists and is available to see on the Berlin Alexanderplatz DVD, and that I've stated before, that could be the best of all Criterion movies. And that Berlin Alexanderplatz isn't just about Nazism in the during the Third Reich. It isn't just about love and the lack thereof. It isn't just about going drunk and going blank about everything. It isn't just about growing up and living and dying in that particular sector of Germany, and about the wall, and about selling out and becoming good and making good and getting trapped by gangsters, and then learning a little thing about love saves, and then you almost decide to drink yourself into an oblivion just from seeing the film. Berlin Alexanderplatz. Although I would recommend what Fassbinder would say is better for your carriage, that would be marijuana. And that's only because, while it's very limited in Fassbinder's films that he's doing so much marijuana behind the camera, but Cecil B. Demented makes the claim that Fassbinder gets high. And I've heard that he smoked. I mean, that's only if you can direct half as good as him, which, so since no one can smoke anymore, because he smoked it all, and it would just be stupid to give someone that kind of credit that they could even be half as good as R.W. Fassbinder. So the new rule, you can only smoke if your last name is Fassbinder, and no, you can smoke if you want. I'm not going to make rules, but the point is that these guys were all about not just breaking rules, but inventing rules of their own, and it would be fair to say that they were inventing rules of their own. That I think Orson Welles' first film is on here, and that his Hearts of Age is a really strange factor, because while it's a silent film, and while you can tell it's a student film, while you can tell they're totally making bad fiction about blackface on purpose, and Hearts of Age is intentional, and I think Welles does justice to mocking the blackface style as though it is the worst evil. And I think that it's kind of unfair that Welles was overlooked for this film, because a lot of times we think Citizen Kane, he was 25, okay, he gets all the credit for that, that's cool, but Hearts of Age isn't too bad. It may not be as good as Citizen Kane, but for a student film, he's 19 years old directing, this is a future that's waiting to happen. And then it's not like the rest of his films is one of the things I like about it. It is, but it's more like The Devil and Daniel Johnson or something. It's like some Faust mythology with him, and it's not really that contagious to use the supernatural in an Orson Welles film, but you feel a sense of the supernatural in almost every avant-garde film. That they try and film ghosts in some of these movies isn't accidental, considering that in Ghost Before Breakfast, it's a reenactment of what the ghosts usually do around there at the table, and that they're filming ghosts. So I'm not going to go so far to say that you can film a ghost, but that they're filming what it would look like if ghosts were missing. And that Hearts of Age is more about these cinematic patterns of folklore that really create a language of cinema later on. Is kind of scary, because it's like him fooling around with the very Paradise Lost effect of getting the last metaphor used before we enter cinema, which has only new metaphors or can create new metaphors out of the old. The Kirstenhoff Egerling, Victor Egerling, we love him. Germain Durlac, Watson, Weber, Steiner, Leisure, Fernand Leisure, and Metzner. Now we look at some of these films, and one of the ones I like off this disc is the Lot in Sodom. I think Lot in Sodom is one of my favorite parts of this avant-garde disc. It comes pretty quickly off the batch, I think, and you may have to get to it on a different disc, but that on the back here, it's called Lot in Sodom. And I think why I bring it up is because it does this amazing sword and sandals set piece kind of thing, where it's got this Lot, in the biblical sense, the story goes that him and his wife and kids are the only righteous people that live in the town, which already is problematic, because I thought the Bible said everybody was unrighteous and compared to God, right? But the next thing you know, it's being written by this whole war community that wants to take out Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Because Sodom and Gomorrah, we conjecture, is a real place. If it is, then somebody else would have had to have ushered in its destruction. But that they would say that it was the destruction of God the way they did it is kind of a mystery today, because we don't see what the destruction of God is unless it's what God has ordered to be destroyed. But I don't know. And then we see God's destruction because then we destroyed it, and for God, right? But this is different, because now God himself is striking this place down, and Abraham argues with him, look, if you can find Lot and his wife here, he's my brother, get him out of there. He's too righteous to die. So that these angels come down, and by this time we're joining Lot and Sodom from the Bible, from the Hebrew Bible, all the way to the Genesis chapter where Lot and his daughters and his wife have to get out of the town as it's collapsing. And there's all this notion of ballet and human interest in Sodom, but that they've wanted to contaminate Lot and his wife with some kind of horrible, sex plague, is already scary. And so it's getting scary all of a sudden. And I think they're resorting to that because somehow if Lot and his wife leave town, I think everyone knows the town will crumble. And there might have been something political with all of the wars that were going on in these primitive ages. Not that it doesn't come right to you as like a possibility of a story, it's another mythology we can see clearly from this. And that it's done in these crossfade ballet type movements throughout the film isn't really alabastering that they're not really saying that homosexuals are to be stricken down by God in this movie. They're saying this guy and his family are escaping while these ragingly angry people are being left to crumble. And so that the film says that everyone seems to be ready for the end of the world that Lot doesn't want to be involved with, only so he can keep reading the Bible, a worthy cause. And so he and his wife leave town. And the famous story is, don't look back, right? That what Lot's wife looks back on Sodom and Gomorrah as it's being destroyed, and she turns to a pillar of stone. And that is interesting because in the Medusa myth, Medusa turns people to stone too, and then you can actually turn them back to human. In Harry Potter, they say with Mandrake or Mandragora, which is like dragon root. That I'm getting to why Lot and Sodom is interesting because it really doesn't get much of the Bible story into it except for the setting of the story, like a sword and sandal epic. And then we come to a film like Cabiria, which is a sword and sandal epic of the silent era. And it is of the most highest of its form as a movie, that it totally rectifies the genius of everything that is sword and sandal movie into one big, massive, full-length feature. But that we're talking about Italy films. They've already been like features since 1911, since Inferno and other films had been features. That in America, our features began in 1913 is of no avail, because in 1915, Birth of a Nation came out, and that set the standard for the longest film, even though Cabiria was a longer film, not just by theory, but by precedent in the history of film, that Cabiria is the film that preceded even Inferno as a smashing big film that could have even taken more to set up than Birth of a Nation, which is hard to believe because it had the most setups of the films made back then. So that I'm always trying to push this beginning of cinema is reminded to me by one of my film friends, Dave Perea, who's saying when you're giving a film class, always introduce the idea that December 12th, 1895 is the most important date in cinema history because it's the beginning of all cinema. It's not the birth of a nation in 1915. It's the birth of cinema, not the movie. It's a train coming into a station in December 12th, 1895. And, we have to say that's 130 years from where we are now, and that's okay that it's been 130, but that Louis Fouillard is beginning to be 120 years old is wild to think that he's still advanced from some of us now. I mean, some of us now can't get as advanced as Fouillard, and here he is 130 years old. And he's not really that old. He passed away, I think, but no one really knows. He might live on in his movies, right? But anyway, the reason I bring up the Sword and Sandal and all this birth of cinema is because the Sword and Sandal epic was really the one that got feature-length films moving, that there were examples of feature films in Australia, not just because they have such a weird time zone did that happen, by the way, but the story of the Kelly gang was the first feature film that had been traced, and I think on the internet it's considered the first feature film, and David Bordwell does that. Not all of it survived, is why we have a hard line between, well, at least some of it survived, because if none of it survived, it would be hard to prove. Even like a requiescence of the film never happened and it never survived, and it was, or Burning Man away, you know, it could happen. And so that film never survived, was still considered a film, but that the films that fall apart by being sitting around so long and without a chemical to revive them and restore them are the very things we're talking about that survive before even the story of the Kelly gang, all the way back to 1895. But the story of the Kelly gang is chip-chopped apart. We still at least have enough of its footage, and I've seen some of it. It's beautiful, to assimilate that it was a full film. That we typically count full films as not just the films accounted for, but those which survive, is only because when we have to say we don't have the film, the reason at the Library of Congress would be because it's lost. The film is lost. We can't find the film. We don't have copies of the film. It's a lost film. That I could go into a short list of lost films that have been discovered, and the real lost footage is the real planet of film buffs career, because they're like, what is the lost footage of Greed? Like, there's 6 hours taken out. I wonder what the lost footage is, you know? So there's questions about footage that didn't survive and whether it still counts as footage or not, because no one knows an answer to that, because either you could win or lose either argument. So it's about at that. So let's just look through these experimental films and see what else we find. We found, The Mirror Has Three Faces. I like The Mirror Had Three Faces. That was kind of a scary one in a haunted house. It kind of had that mentally monotone movement kind of thing to it, although that had 3 stories or 4 stories in one, and tied them all together. Was a good one. Rhythmus 21, it's like a cartoon, but it's like moving blocks and moving triangles in a form of, these are all silent films anyway. These are the avant-garde silent films that most of these guys were from Paris. Is interesting because they went to that film school in France. That was where they were from, and that Orson Welles and Eisenstein are in this group shows that they had film clubs where these amazing directors and planners of films would get together and have a film career even through the avant-garde, and that, like Duchamp and Man Ray were so heavy, and even Pan Leaf, who was more science, and I'll talk about him in a minute. But Duchamp and Ray were so here and now, with the here and now, that they wanted their avant-garde films to be only screened where avant-garde films only are screened. That they wanted to be known as only avant-garde, nothing else. And that Pan Leaf actually became an avant-gardist kind of by proxy, because what happened with him was that he was making these experiments of like filming what was under a microscope, and that there's been many breakthroughs from his science about atoms splitting through osmosis and asexual reproduction, where osmosis takes place and 2 cells split. And Pan Leaf would film these kind of things as cell splitting, or a cell becoming a mitochondrion where it suddenly has an arm. You see those in these specimens that they're taking with Pan Leaf, who's really taking a lot of sea experiment specimens in these biological experiments. And that his biological experiments are filmed at such a satanically wild pace that you're just like, this is hard science. And you got to understand that even though some of the time you're watching it, you have to tell your friends that they're not really experiencing evolution before their eyes. But I always kind of thought that asexual osmosis for an amoeba was evolution, but I don't know. I could say that proves it, but then I'd be way out of my league, you know. But apparently he was the scientist that proved all that. It's not hard to believe, considering he was the first to make movies of his microscopic findings, that they ended up being completely a washout to everything that he loved about science, because they sold the sciences while selling the avant-garde ministry of early French film that hadn't just lapsed into the avant-garde, but that was going through a poetic realist movement. That Children of Paradise is one of those Aristotle-type movies that we're still have gotten to, but we can get to in a second, because Children of Paradise is the one where it's like if you were to take Cocteau and O Fool, and then you would have the director of Children of Paradise, which I'm going to go take. Don't take a rate class. Don't take a rate class. And this is not a mistake. I thought I'd bring down something to show you all in the media form how prepared I was to get to this one. And that this is, hang on. Marcel Carné is the director. Now, you'll have to take a point off for all of us that couldn't remember that incidentally, but saw the cover and remembered it. And that it has several of the greatest actors in France in this film. And why I bring this out isn't because it just so dawned on me I needed to know the director's name, which was one of the main reasons I own cinema. You don't think that's a bad reason, do you? Do you say no? Say no. Because, like, Children of Paradise will take us into a total taxonomy of what we learned from Aristotle's Poetics. That they're an acting troupe is already showing them that they make plays about making plays, and that making plays about making plays is showing about cinema making movies about making cinema, because cinema is plays to the Aristotle Poetics of the poetic realism, that the objectification and subjectification of gender is sometimes vulnerable, but in the melodrama form that this musical comedy is also at, but melodramatic, heretofore say that it's a long version of reality, that the theatrical long takes are at play, that the voices are muted almost to a certainty of equality among the players who are equal except bound to the theater, that there's romance at all, and that there's behind the scenes romance and romances that aren't working out and other ones that are forming behind others that are working out, is a total classical poetic realist type romantic world. But that Marcel Carné plays it out with the whole theatrical squad playing out their play of the play that this play is in, is already the farce we need to get through Aristotle's Poetics and see them working for what he said. Because when you're taxing all the levels of reality through your long takes, and you're putting all the decor into the scene with your operational romantic lens that captures all the soft of a woman and all the hard-edged of a man, and that you're capturing with your editing no take to be noticed between match on movement and equal match on movement that's taped out like a theater box. And that there's things get broken in this, windows get broken, that sometimes there's bits of war involved in, but for the most part it's one of the most heartbreaking things you'll see getting into a film like this, and seeing everybody fall in love, and then that some of them don't even stay in love, is something that I don't want to talk about, because it's so horrible in a romantic movie when they won't stay in love, when you so know they're meant to stay in love. And while Doug the Cirque is really good at that in All That Heaven Allows in his other movies, this is melodrama performed melodramatically by the melodramatists. And you're not going to get a better chance to see what it's like to see classical Shakespearean type theater you have here almost, the French theater, stemming off from that. Or you have classical Aristotelian Greek theater, which this follows the mythologies of the Oedipal and the Medea, and has the mythology of the Hercules, and has the mythology of the Maze and the Minotaur. Is not just because it's harking on some of those Italian film things we were thinking about in break a while back, me and some students, about Fellini's 8.5, and about how in Fellini's 8.5 he's more avant-garde than the realism of Children of Paradise seems to be avant-garde just because it's so realistic. Well, 8.5 will take you through this maze in Hollywood, and I'm not going to go jump up, get 8.5, because we know Fellini. And in Fellini's 8.5 that you're taking off through this whole mission to watch Fellini masquerade around with all of his women so that he can tell them and tell the press that he's going to create a movie called 8.5. And that 8.5 is the movie that we're watching, has nothing to do with the movie he's creating, which are one and the same, by the way. No one's supposed to know that. So that it's a character playing Fellini's character isn't even, though he's called Fellini, I'm not even sure it's not. No, it's not. But it's Marcello Mastroianni playing Fellini, and so we're getting some real comedy, because every time Marcello Mastroianni plays him, he's a little bit gangster, but he's all the way gangster cinema, right? And that he's putting on his best long takes means that Fellini is known for the best long takes, and you can't really say that in spectacle arenas, especially those sword and sandal epics of Cabiria, that they've ever topped Knights of Cabiria by Fellini, which is way more secular in how it determines its camera in the reality mode of Fellini in Knights of Cabiria, which was one of his only realist, like Italian neo-realist films, which still totally counts as one. And then at 8.5, we have just the sake of cinema for the sake of cinema. I know you all love that at home, I say that, but that's just not even cool, because you got to understand what that means has very productive rules. It means it has to be a movie about a movie. It has to be sometimes set to such extravagance, but not like budget extravagance, wink, wink, right? But set to such extravagance that it couldn't be topped in any other medium. It's like a cubist painting taking over for the real in these avant-garde movies. And that cinema, for the sake of cinema, bowls over politics and psychology and reams them for even existing, and totally takes advantage of their meanings. And there's not many directors that can get away with this style and still do it, but that smolders over with its revenge of, I figured out how something new to do with film is. And that's why I'm pushing this film. Can work, because, again, 1895, birth of cinema. We all know it was pushing things the cinema hadn't seen before, because the cinema hadn't been invented yet, and there's things we hadn't seen in the cinema before. So remember those rules when I just say cinema for the sake of cinema, because that just seems like a free-for-all. But that we know free-for-alls usually die first, because I've seen some of those happen, and sometimes you get the right image, and it can come down on the right verse of what you want it to be in the movie and play and scenography and all that, all the scenery that's within the photography and how that captures a world, even if it's only seen through this rectangle-shaped TV, And that's how we look into that world and see the things we don't normally see ourselves, because there's someone else looking at the same thing from an angle that we've never gotten, because getting to the same angles would be almost infinitely impossible unless you use theatrical measuring of where to set the proscenium, which I do believe cinema has, except that the screen in cinema can't get as big as the screen in theater yet, because the theater isn't really on a screen. And I made you all think that theater was suddenly on a screen, because we've all seen plays that have been filmed on movies that are on screen, and they're beautiful movies. And that's what Children of Paradise is kind of saying, is that we're a theater movie on screen, but that they go through so much to make it a film event is really why it's so loving of the French theater and the French poetic realism, telling us we love poetic real theater is still not enough to make up for everybody breaking up by the end and us all sobbing. So that most of these were the French filmmakers too of this era before this movie, which is right around the time that the war ended, and that this movie is about 4.5 hours long. And there's a version of Les Miserables by Raymond Bernard that's about, hang on, that's about 5 minutes. There's a Raymond Bernard movie that's Les Miserables that's about 5 hours, and there's some other movies that have gone that length that I've always get to the point and say Out 27 is the longest at 27 hours. Ken Burns. Jazz being 22 hours, 23 hours. I've seen some other Raymond Bernard movies too that seem to be long, and that there's lengthy films out there, don't get me wrong, but that for the Gone with the Wind length of 4 hours and all those lengthy movies, there's still a limitation to all of them compared to Berlin Alexanderplatz, which was 15 hours, and that this is 5 hours, and La Rue was 5 hours, or naming like a lot of these big name long movies like Napoleon by Abel Gance and all that. And I hope that the new Napoleon is just as good, if not better, that it has anything to do with any of the productions of Napoleon. And I say that Hollywood fight the good fight and release as many films as it can, because we're going to talk about how good they are. And we always tell everybody that they're making good films. And if you don't think a film is good, watch it again from the perspective maybe the artist wanted you to watch it from, and that may help you to see better what they're trying to do with it. And if you can't watch it from their perspective, there's always someone that can be there for the artist's perspective, or at least to trust that us, with knowing that they're showing us great artworks of their own, and we have to just trust that. And I think we can all trust that of the artists we've talked about today and always. And I think that's one thing about poetics that we'll keep in mind, is that Aristotle is talking about an artist, playwright, artist-driven media, artist, actor, artist-driven media. And that we thank them and respectfully tell them how great they are is a good habit to get into. And then good to be like Plato, thank a soldier. Just find a soldier and thank him. All right, that's about it for class. We talked a lot about different things, and I hope you didn't get too confused by some of the terminology, but it really wasn't that metaphoricalized of a royal flush. You've still got more to learn about the Aristotle poetics and the avant-garde movement. Children of Paradise, I'm just beginning my speech on, but that we discussed other long movies too was great, and I've had a real good time, and I hope we can get back together in a few days and have our next class. All right, thank you.